So went boot camp at Paris Island and San Diego, where in less than 3 months, raw recruits became fledgling Marines in the only way the Corps wanted to do the job. It had taken young men, little different from counterparts in the Army and Navy, and molded them by Marine Corps methods into indomitable fighters. They had been driven to the limits of their physical stamina, browbeaten and cajoled, worried over and encouraged, understood and misunderstood. But they were learning their new trade, what it meant to be a fighting Marine. When they marched in review on graduation day, they were in the best physical condition of their lives, and they marched with the pride that only a Marine can know. On the way to learning the basic rudiments of the uncompromising terminate or be terminated business of war, they had been imbued with the élan and raison d'être of the Marine Corps. They had passed the first test. Ultimate testing would come later in battle, and they were full-fledged members of a very special breed of fighting men. For the rest of their lives, and for many this would be a tragically short time, they would glory in the words, "Once a Marine, always a Marine." Drew Middleton, the distinguished military correspondent for the New York Times, captured this mystical transformation perfectly when he wrote in late 1983 about an indefinable inner strength that seemed to flow through the very bloodstream of the Marine Corps. He traced much of this quality directly back to the crucible of boot camp, noting that graduates never forgot the experience. A certain type of brotherhood was forged during those intense weeks, a bond that transcended time, rank, and circumstance, creating connections that would last lifetimes. In 1958, when Marines landed in Beirut during that crisis, an American ambassador visiting a Marine attack ship struck up a conversation with a sergeant. Curious about the man's background, the diplomat asked when he had graduated from Paris Island. The Marine proudly replied that he had been in the class of 1948. "Ah," the ambassador responded with a knowing smile, "I was a bit ahead of you, class of 1912. A select few outstanding graduates departed San Diego and Paris Island, wearing the single stripe of private's first class, a mark of distinction that set them apart from their peers. Following 2 weeks of precious leave, for many the only time they would see home until war's end, and for far too many the last time ever, these newly minted Marines received their assignments to combat units where they would face the ultimate test of their training. The majority found themselves bound for infantry outfits, filling the essential roles that formed the backbone of Marine fighting units. They became riflemen, the heart and soul of every assault, machine gunners who would lay down the devastating suppressing fire that allowed their comrades to advance, flamethrower operators who would clear enemy bunkers with streams of liquid fire, demolitions experts who would blast through the strongest fortifications, company clerks who would maintain the vital paperwork that kept units functioning, buglers who would sound the calls to battle, cooks and bakers who would sustain their comrades with hot meals whenever possible, and drivers who would man the trucks and jeeps that kept the Marine war machine moving forward. Others received specialized assignments that would take them to tank battalions, where they would crew the armored beasts that spearheaded assaults across Pacific beaches. Some learned to operate Amtraks, those ungainly but essential amphibious vehicles that would carry Marines from ship to shore through withering enemy fire. A fortunate few secured the coveted sea duty, serving aboard the great battleships, sleek cruisers, and mighty aircraft carriers that would provide the naval gunfire support so crucial to amphibious operations. Those blessed with strong aptitudes for electronics and aircraft engines found themselves assigned to aviation units, where they would serve as gunners protecting Marine aircraft, communications specialists, maintaining the vital links between air and ground forces, and ground crewmen keeping the Corsairs and other aircraft flying in combat conditions. But regardless of their specific duties or where fate would ultimately take them, these Marines shared one haunting common experience. They would forever remember boot camp and the crusty drill instructors who had shaped them into warriors. Those hard-bitten veterans had shown their charges giant pictorial displays that burned themselves into memory photographs of dead Marines floating face down in the blood-red lagoon at Tarawa, images of headless torsos scattered across the coral of Peleliu like broken dolls. "Look at this," the instructors had commanded, their voices cutting through the shocked silence of recruits, seeing the reality of war for the first time. "This is what you will face in a few months." It was brutal honesty, designed not to discourage but to prepare these young men for the unimaginable horrors that awaited them. Statistics would later show that 8 out of every 10 Marines would witness comrades wounded or killed in battle, yet there was hardly a man among them who did not believe he would be among the lucky ones, that fate would somehow spare him from the carnage ahead. I made it through the difficulty of boot camp, ran the common thread of confidence and optimism that sustained the cocky, self-assured new Marines. And I can make it the rest of the way. This visionary hope would prove tragically misplaced for thousands who would fall at Iwo Jima, just as it had been for thousands before them in earlier Pacific campaigns. Yet it was precisely this optimism, this refusal to accept defeat, that would drive them forward when lesser men might have faltered and broken. Fear became their constant companion once they reached the front lines. General Kuribayashi's ingenious fortifications, his fanatically determined defenders, the grinding terrain that seemed designed by some malevolent god, the thunder of battle that never seemed to cease, the sights and cries of wounded and dying comrades, all of these constantly stoked the fires of fear among the Marines who fought on Iwo Jima. It stands as the enduring mark of their courage that they overcame that fear, day after day, assault after assault, even when their bodies screamed for rest and their minds reeled from the horror surrounding them. Francis Cockrell, who lived through the nightmare and emerged to tell the tale, later reflected on the true nature of combat with the wisdom born of experience. It is difficult to imagine battle without thinking of heroics and dramatics, of dashing figures and climactic spectacles, he observed with quiet intensity. Iwo Jima certainly had more than enough of these stirring moments, he remembered, but far more often it was simply dangerous drudgery, mean, exhausting work at which men got shot and blown apart. The predominant feelings were not glory or triumph, but frustration and bone-deep tiredness and anger that threatened to consume the soul. When a mission was accomplished with minimum loss of life, there was grim satisfaction. When too many good men fell, there was rage and sorrow that could overwhelm even the strongest warrior. You could read their story in their eyes and on their faces, in the ragged uniforms that hung from their lean frames like tattered flags of endurance. They had acquired what Gene Jones would later remember as the look of the hawk, a predatory intensity born of constant vigilance and the knowledge that death lurked around every corner. Their eyes had grown hard and cruel, with encrusted dirt ringing the deep sockets like primitive war paint. Their skin had turned pallid from weeks of combat stress and inadequate nutrition, while pimples and blemishes and freckles stood out like large nail-heads on the faces of these young warriors, giving them an appearance both youthful and ancient. Stubbles of beards marked the older men, those grizzled veterans in their early 20s who had survived multiple campaigns and earned the right to be called old salts. Some sported heavy mustaches that had taken months to grow, wearing them as badges of rank and combat experience. These facial adornments marked the corporals and sergeants, the non-commissioned officers who formed the backbone of Marine leadership and knew how to keep their men alive in impossible situations. Everyone spoke in the muttered cadence and hoarse tones of men with sore and parched throats, their voices roughened by shouting orders over the din of battle and breathing the acrid smoke of explosions. Their conversation might be studied with stoic humor about their desperate situation, but there was seldom genuine laughter, perhaps a few tight grins about their malefic plight, but little more. More often than not, they had been standing next to a close buddy when enemy fire cut him down, watching the light fade from familiar eyes, knowing that it could just as easily have been them. They had known nauseating fear that clutched at their guts like icy fingers, and many had vomited at the horrors they witnessed, human bodies torn apart by high explosives, friends screaming for their mothers as they died. They had shaken with the terrifying realization that they could be the next to fall, their bodies added to the growing pile of American dead that littered the black volcanic sand of this god-forsaken island. Their clothing told its own story of hardship and endurance. These were the raggedy-assed Marines on parade, described in an irreverent but honest World War I marching song. Sergeant Gilbert Bailey, a Marine correspondent who had witnessed more than his share of combat, captured their appearance with brutal honesty. He looks like a sandhog who has long gone without a shave or a bath. His tired eyes are the mark of an inner struggle between dread and courage. He carries his souvenirs with him, a bullet hole in his helmet, a crease in his canteen, a bayonet cut in his dungaree jacket, a slight wound that does not amount to anything. Bailey, who had endured the early dark days of Guadalcanal and participated in the vicious struggle with the 4th Division on Saipan, found even deeper meaning in these battle-worn warriors. These men would be legendary characters if history could absorb them, he wrote with obvious admiration. Unnoticed people who, for the first time in their lives, heard the call of greatness and glory, and recognized it when it came. He wrote of corporals who were wounded 3 times, but always talked their way back into the lines, to get back to my outfit, displaying a loyalty that transcended rational thought. Such dedication was commonplace among Marines, yet largely unrecognized by the outside world. Stories will never be written about most of them, Bailey observed with evident sadness. There are too many, and what they do has come to be taken for granted. What drove the men of Iwo Jima and those in all the other savage Marine campaigns in the war against Japan? What set them apart from others who might have faltered and broken under the constant nightmare of massacre? Where did they find the strength to conquer their fears, displaying what seemed like indifference to suffering and death as comrades crumpled around them like broken toys? These questions have puzzled military historians and psychologists for decades, creating endless debates about the nature of courage and human endurance. Were the Marines braver, more valorous than the millions of Americans who fought other battles in a global war that showed no mercy to human frailties? Were they more patriotic and dedicated, possessed of a deeper pride in themselves, their units, and their devotion to flag and country? Were discipline and leadership stronger among the Marines, binding them together with some unfathomable understanding of purpose and unity that transcended individual survival? Were they simply better trained than other fighting men to endure the inhuman struggle where every day brought fresh horrors and new tests of human endurance? What mysterious force creates and sparks and sustains such men who will accept nothing less than victory or death, who will charge into machine gun fire because their sergeant told them to, who will hold their ground when every instinct screams at them to run? Even the most resolute Marine Corps hardliners have found it nearly impossible through the years to divine and explain why Marines stand alone as a special breed of warrior, different from all other fighting men. General Paul X. Kelly, who served as commandant in 1984 when hundreds of Marines were dying in Lebanon, attempted to define what it meant to be a Marine but found words completely inadequate to the task. It is like trying to describe your feeling for your country, your wife, and your children. Kelly told Drew Middleton in obvious frustration. It is there, but words are insufficient to capture the essence of it. Middleton elaborated on this theme with the insight of a seasoned military observer who had covered wars around the globe. The Corps is at once a home and a profession. It is set apart from the other fighting services, removed from the people it serves by an almost mystic belief on the part of the Marines that the Corps is unique, that it can do anything that needs to be done, no matter how impossible it might seem. While Middleton wrote these words about Marines serving in Lebanon in 1983 and 1984, they served as an equally accurate reflection of the Marines who fought on Iwo Jima, and indeed of all Marines in every battle fought by the Corps since its creation in 1775. In 1950, an official manual made a valiant attempt to explain the complex, indefinable inner psyche of Marines with typical military precision. The Corps, it stated, emphasizes the rugged outlet for men's energies and never permits its members to forget that the example of courage is their most precious heritage, passed down from generation to generation like a sacred trust. Frank Huff, the distinguished military historian who had studied the Marine Corps extensively, believed the answer lay almost entirely in the concept of esprit de corps, that virtual blood oath binding Marines together, the sacred understanding that one Marine would never let another down in combat, no matter what the cost. To fail to live up to this code was nothing short of treason, a betrayal of faith in everything worthwhile and sacred that the Corps represented. Observing this mode of thought carried into action, Huff wrote in 1947, had led more than one outsider to remark that these men seemed to be fighting less for the United States than for the United States Marine Corps itself. Thousands of Marines found themselves on Iwo Jima because they genuinely wanted to be there. Not that they would have selected this particular hellish island as a battleground if given any choice in the matter, but because they wanted to be Marines above all else. They were ready to go without question wherever and whenever the Corps' globe and anchor battle flags led them, whether it was a tropical paradise or the gates of hell itself. Membership in this elite corps represented to them the highest possible calling as rugged individuals whose first duty was to the Marine Corps, then to God and country, in that exact order. These were the old salts, the old breed of non-commissioned and commissioned officers, men like the legendary John Basilone and Chandler Johnson, whose home, career, and very life were, by conscious choice, the Marine Corps. They were the old pros, most in their mid-20s or early 30s, who had met and defeated the Japanese in earlier campaigns across the Pacific. Some had faced the enemy as many as 4 times, beginning with that first desperate struggle at Guadalcanal, when the outcome of the entire Pacific War hung in the balance. It was a rarity for any of them to have escaped being wounded at least once by the time they splashed ashore on Iwo Jima's black volcanic beaches, carrying their scars as badges of honor. Immediately following the attack on Pearl Harbor, thousands of 18- and 19-year-olds had flocked to Marine recruiting stations across America, driven by a burning desire to fight the Japanese and to be part of the best military organization in the world until the war was won. Now they were in their early 20s, seasoned by battle, motivated by that indefinable Marine elan that set them apart from all other fighting men, and ready to fight once more on this sulfur island that would test them beyond anything they had previously experienced. This spirit was not confined to the World War II generation, but continued to burn brightly in young Americans decades later. Peter S. Payne III, a junior at Princeton University enrolled in the platoon leader course, told Middleton in 1983 with the same fierce pride, "I am in the Marines, quite simply, because they are the best. When the Marines have a job to do, they do not compromise, they do not make excuses, they simply get it done." Many of the senior non-commissioned officers on Iwo Jima, the platoon sergeants, gunnery sergeants, and first sergeants who formed the backbone of Marine leadership, had originally joined up during the tag-end days of the Great Depression, when civilian jobs were impossible to find and young men faced bleak futures. Now they knew no other life than the Marine Corps and were utterly devoted to it, to the sense of belonging it provided, to its traditions and comradeship that sustained them through the darkest hours when death seemed to lurk around every corner. Almost without exception, the battalion and regimental commanders on Iwo Jima were career officers, majors, lieutenant colonels, and colonels whose thick service records revealed impressive credentials earned through years of dedicated service. Many had graduated from the prestigious Naval Academy at Annapolis, while others came from historic private institutions like Virginia Military Academy, which for more than a century had produced an imposing number of commanders for all branches of America's armed forces. Others were graduates of colleges and universities across the country, who had earned their commissions from the Marine Corps' renowned trade school at Quantico, Virginia, where they had learned the art and science of leading Marines in combat. Some were Mustangs men who had enlisted fresh out of high school and advanced promotion by promotion through the ranks, with years of exemplary service before becoming officers, earning their positions through merit rather than education. Many of these leaders had served as corporals and sergeants in the Philippines and China, fighting the bandits in Latin America's minor upheavals during the 1920s and 30s, gaining invaluable experience in small unit combat that would serve them well in the Pacific. All 3 division generals, Erskine, Cates, and Rocky, had served as second lieutenants in France during World War I, where they had been wounded and decorated for valor and leadership, while learning firsthand what it meant to lead men in desperate circumstances. John Lardner once observed that if the Marine Corps has a battle cry, it is the rebel yell, and indeed a seemingly large number of Marines, both officers and enlisted men, were Southerners or came from small towns scattered across rural America. But the Leathernecks at Iwo Jima were far more than just a fraternity of Confederate descendants or an assemblage of warriors from farms and hamlets. Men who came from the streets of big cities and metropolitan suburbs probably outnumbered their rural counterparts, bringing urban toughness and street smarts to complement country strength and endurance. All were equally dedicated to the values and traditions of the Corps that had become their spiritual home. There was a broad ethnic mix of second-generation Americans among the Marines, with one glaring exception that reflected the racial attitudes of the time: blacks. Like the rest of America's armed forces during World War II, the Marine Corps remained segregated by official policy that would not change for several more years. In boot camp, black recruits trained in separate platoons, and after completing recruit training, they were assigned to pioneer battalions or field depots, where they served as service and supply troops, denied the opportunity to serve as frontline infantry. A scattered few became cooks and bakers, while others served as mess attendants to senior officers, roles that reflected the limited opportunities available to them within the military hierarchy. Despite their second-class status within the organization, Black Marines proved vital to victory in many campaigns and were often under fire on the beaches and in the front lines, displaying the same courage and dedication as their white counterparts. Frank Huff remembered one particularly valiant outfit during the vicious fighting on Peleliu with obvious admiration. The Negro Marines of the 16th Field Depot, he recalled, had distinguished themselves throughout the operation as stretcher-bearers, working under the heaviest fire and most difficult conditions with courage, cheerfulness, and patience that was notable even among the hardened veterans of the 1st Division. About sunset on any given afternoon during that campaign, small groups of these Marines could be seen trudging forward from their rear area behind a sergeant or corporal, ready to do their part in the front lines where the fighting was fiercest. They were volunteers, every single one of them, stepping forward when others might have found excuses to stay behind. By that point in the campaign, this unit had earned the reputation of being the most volunteer-minded outfit in the entire Marine Corps, a distinction they wore with quiet pride. One officer was deeply embarrassed on one occasion when, calling for volunteers for what he assumed would be a dangerous mission, he watched his entire unit step forward before he had time to explain that this was merely a burial detail rather than a combat assignment. The men of the 16th Field Depot wrote a bright chapter at Peleliu in their race's contribution to the history of the war, proving that courage knows no color. The same could be said of Black Marines at Iwo Jima, where they served with equal distinction despite the constraints of a segregated military system. Iwo Jima's remorseless chamber of horrors claimed its inevitable toll of men who simply broke under the unrelenting strain that would have crushed lesser spirits. Most of the 1,897 cases of combat fatigue proved temporary individuals who had absorbed all they could handle for the moment and were pulled from the front lines for rest and recovery, their minds temporarily overwhelmed by the constant exposure to death and destruction. Some cases were so severe that the affected Marines required complete evacuation from the island, their minds shattered by experiences no human being should ever have to endure. Others spent the remainder of the campaign assigned to non-combatant duties in rear areas, contributing to the war effort in ways that did not require them to face the immediate prospect of violent death. But the vast majority returned to their units within days, many to fight with renewed valor until they were wounded or killed as the battle continued to rage with undiminished fury. Throughout all the fighting, not one Marine unit panicked under fire or deserted its assigned position, a remarkable testament to training, leadership, and esprit de corps that held men together when everything else seemed to be falling apart. Captain George K. Dyke, a 26-year-old farmer from Grafton, North Dakota, commanded the 1st Artillery Battalion to land on the island and witnessed firsthand the human cost of combat. During the fighting, he discovered 2 men cowering in a deep foxhole, shaking with such overpowering fear that their legs refused to function, their minds paralyzed by terror. "I know I am useless," one of them told the captain with heartbreaking honesty, his voice barely above a whisper. "Shoot me and get it over with." Both men were evacuated as serious battle fatigue cases and, after receiving treatment, were assigned to duties in rear areas where they could contribute to the war effort without facing immediate combat. According to Dyke, neither was shot or court-martialed as far as I know, reflecting the Marine Corps' understanding that every man had his breaking point and that reaching it was not a mark of cowardice but simply human limitation. Even some Marines who had been decorated for bravery in previous campaigns found themselves overwhelmed by the unique horrors of Iwo Jima, the massive enemy shelling that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, the withering machine gun fire that cut down anyone who showed himself for even a moment, the cascades of exploding hand grenades that filled the air with deadly fragments, the torture of trying to advance across terrain that seemed specifically designed to eliminate human life, the agony of watching close comrades blown to pieces before their eyes. "There is fear in every man," General Erskine acknowledged with characteristic honesty that set him apart from commanders who tried to pretend their men were superhuman, and every man has his breaking point somewhere. It was the measure of the men who fought on Iwo Jima, the general believed with deep conviction, that most beat back their fears, as they did the Japanese, and, in so doing, did not break when lesser men would have crumbled. "Mrs. Rose Stein, the Yugoslavian mother of Medal of Honor winner Tony Stein, perhaps understood her son's motivation better than anyone when she tried to explain why he had chosen the Marines over other service branches. When asked by reporters, she replied with simple wisdom that cut to the heart of the Marine spirit. Tony always had to do things, hard things. That is why he just had to be in the Marines. He wanted to see if he could do it, if he could measure up to the ultimate test. Newspapers across the country carried her statement when it was made on December 15, 1945, as his body was brought home for final burial 9 months after he had sacrificed his life on Iwo Jima. Her words captured something essential about the Marine spirit, the need to test oneself against the ultimate challenge, to find out what lay within when everything else was stripped away. General Alexander A. Vandergrift Sr., who had led the 1st Marine Division through the hell of Guadalcanal and now commanded the entire Corps as its 4-star leader, had his own understanding of how Iwo Jima and the other Pacific islands were conquered through sheer determination and sacrifice. The battles were won, he declared with the authority of experience, by the individual fighting man operating as a member of a squad, a platoon, a company, not by grand strategy or superior weapons, but by individual Marines doing their duty. Through his experience in 2 world wars and numerous smaller campaigns in the Caribbean and Central America, he had learned that esprit de corps was absolutely essential to victory. But he had also discovered through bitter experience that, in the heat of battle, a man cannot stop to think about the larger ideal. He must fight with courage and resourcefulness because his own life and his self-respect, without which few men can live, depend upon association with, and the respect of, in his comrades who share the danger with him. At the opposite end of the military hierarchy was Private Wilson D. Watson of the 3rd Division, a man from the Ozark Mountains of northwest Arkansas who had his own definite ideas about courage and how Marines achieved victory on Iwo Jima. "Man, we had to forget about being afraid and do what we had to do," Watson explained in his characteristic drawl, his voice carrying the simple wisdom of a man who had seen too much. "And that was terminate the goddamned Japanese and win the goddamned battle, no matter what it cost us." His words were spoken to a Marine correspondent who interviewed the slight, soft-spoken rifleman after he had been awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions with his Browning automatic rifle. Though not reported at the time due to military censorship, his simple philosophy captured the essence of Marine determination, the ability to focus on the mission when everything else seemed hopeless. Wherever Marines fought in the Pacific, black humor became an integral part of the beachhead lifestyle, a psychological defense mechanism that helped men cope with the unthinkable reality surrounding them. Iwo Jima proved no exception to this rule of survival through laughter. 50 yards up the narrow roadway that had been bulldozed through the slopes of Suribachi, some enterprising Marine had erected a hand-lettered sign that became a classic of military wit: Suribachi Heights Realty Company, ocean view, cool breezes, free fireworks, nightly. Another sign, painted in fire engine red paint brought ashore by its author, a 5th Division corporal with an artistic bent, appeared over the entrance of a burned-out cave. Ichimoto's Inn, under new management. Soon available to personnel of the United States Army, we hope. The dig at the Army, reflecting typical inter-service rivalry, brought smiles to Marine faces even in the midst of hell. A 4th Division Marine, whose temporary living quarters were situated near Charlie Dog Ridge, used a cardboard ration box and a heavy crayon to post his statement of property ownership in crude but effective lettering. Notice, this foxhole is privately owned, and was not constructed with the help of the Federal Housing Administration, not built for comfort but for speed. The reference to government housing programs brought a touch of home to this godforsaken place. Half a dozen Marine correspondents and photographers had established temporary residence in a blockhouse atop a 30-foot cliff just north of Motoyama No. 1. The fortification had previously served as an enemy communications center, but now provided relatively comfortable quarters where they could return each day to write their copy and captions and catch some desperately needed sleep. Each morning, when they departed for the front lines to document the ongoing carnage, a warning sign was hung above the fortification's entrance to discourage squatters. Its 6-inch letters proclaimed with mock seriousness, "Danger! Mined and booby-trapped." The ruse worked for exactly 2 days, providing them with luxury accommodations by Iwo Jima standards. "We had all the comforts of home," recalled Sergeant Harold A. Breard of Monroe, Louisiana, one of the lucky occupants. But we should have known it was too good to last long. On the third day, conscientious demolitions experts took the warning at face value and blew the structure to smithereens in a spectacular explosion that could be heard for miles. Easy come, easy go, was Breard's philosophical reaction to losing their palace. For the rest of the time on Iwo, we lived in foxholes like everyone else, getting acquainted with the local insect population. Behind the front lines, where reserve troops dug in for the night, Marines talked among themselves during the brief twilight hours before darkness fell, and the island became a different kind of battlefield. Dick Dashiell, a correspondent who moved among these men, recorded some of these conversations that revealed the humanity behind the warrior facade, the ordinary concerns that persisted even in extraordinary circumstances. "My wife's birthday comes this month," one Marine mentioned to no one in particular, his voice carrying across the gathering darkness. "She turns 18. The statement hung in the air, a reminder of the life that existed beyond this island of death. A platoon sergeant offered his own observation with typical Marine practicality. "If there is any justice in this world, it won't rain tonight, so those Japanese cannot collect fresh water in their caves." A husky Marine approached his lieutenant with grim purpose, carrying the personal effects of the fallen. "Here is a letter they found in Mike's pocket right after he died. Thought you might want to see what he was writing." A tired-looking Marine materialized from the gathering darkness, prompting an outburst of joy from his comrades. "My God! There's Smitty!" "Hey, Smitty, I heard you were dead." "Damn you! I was feeling sorry for you and wondering how to write your folks." A Marine who had been on outpost duty shared his night's experience with the matter-of-fact tone of a man who had seen too much. "You should have heard those Japanese yelling last night. When we sealed up that cave with explosives, they hollered and squealed all night long like animals caught in a trap." A plaintive voice expressed the universal longing that echoed in every Marine's heart. "Say, Sarge, you think we can secure this rock in a few more days? Boy, the army's welcome to this place. I would go nuts if I had to stay here much longer." A corporal managed a grin despite everything surrounding them. "Had some real coffee today, not that ersatz stuff. Feel like $1,000,000 now." An officer spoke almost to himself, his voice heavy with the weight of survival and loss. "All the officers I came overseas with are gone now, all dead or wounded. I'm the only one left from the original group." One of his men responded quietly, understanding the terrible burden of being among the survivors. "I know how you feel, Lieutenant. Trinkler and I are the only ones left out of our tent. The rest are all gone." Another Marine made a simple request that spoke volumes about the human need for companionship in the face of death. "Mind if I hole in with you fellows tonight? My buddy hasn't come back from patrol yet, and I don't want to be alone." Someone else brought up the eternal Marine pastime that persisted even in hell. "Any of you guys get any souvenirs?" "Me, I'm through souvenir hunting. The other day I reached out for a Japanese rifle and a sniper almost took my hand off. Not worth the risk anymore." A languid voice broke in with a housing request that showed how quickly men adapted to impossible circumstances. "Anybody know of a good abandoned pillbox? I'm tired of foxhole life and want something with a roof over my head." An unexpected bit of levity emerged from the darkness. "Comb that hair, boy, comb that hair. There's nothing that will help win this war like combing your hair and looking like a Marine." A few men managed genuine smiles at this absurd insistence on military appearance standards in the middle of combat. "When the hell is Sunday? I lost track of time completely. Meant to go to church too, but haven't seen a chaplain in days. Where's the guy who said we would take this island in 5 days? I hope he's on the front lines right now getting a reality check." Oh, looks like that Japanese mortar hit some guys over yonder. Hope they're okay." Sudden quiet fell over the group as they listened for cries for help. A mortar shell whistled overhead, followed by an urgent exclamation. "Look at this, Charlie. Wonder when that bullet landed here. I'm moving to a different spot. You guys can stay here and get picked off by a sniper if you want to. Me, I've got to get back to the command post where it's safer. Those rats stomped around our pillbox last night making noise. They must have been wearing horseshoes the way they clattered around." After a moment of contemplative silence, "There are only 2 kinds of Marines on this island, the lucky and the unlucky. Let's hit the sack. It's 7 o'clock and we need whatever sleep we can get." Marines welcomed the arrival of twilight each day, despite knowing it meant facing another night of harassment fire and possible infiltration attempts by desperate Japanese soldiers. They were simply grateful to have survived another day of combat, to still be breathing when so many of their comrades had fallen. As darkness settled over the island like a shroud, artillery and mortar fire generally decreased in intensity, though it never stopped completely. Small arms fire gradually petered out as both sides settled into their defensive positions. An eerie stillness descended over the battlefield, something akin to Times Square without traffic, or a steel mill without its roaring blast furnaces, an unnatural quiet that made every small sound seem magnified. The lines would erupt again in various sectors when Marine outposts detected enemy infiltration attempts, or when the Japanese unleashed their mortars and artillery from hidden positions in sudden, violent outbursts. Otherwise, the relative lull would continue until total darkness provided cover for both sides to resupply and reposition, to evacuate wounded and bring up reinforcements. "It's like a change in shifts at the Chrysler plant back in Highland Park," observed a black Marine from the 4th Pioneer Battalion, his voice carrying the longing of a man far from home. "But I sure wish I was back working on the assembly line in Detroit instead of being here on this god-forsaken island where people are trying to kill me." After D-Day+5, sunset brought strange new sights and sounds to the island that must have seemed like something from a science fiction story. The appearance of 2 carrier-based torpedo bombers laying down clouds of DDT from shoreline to shoreline across the American front must have triggered shockwaves of fear among the Japanese defenders, who likely believed the Americans had begun using poison gas in violation of international law. What both sides witnessed, and what Marines had been briefed to expect, was actually a public health measure designed to prevent epidemic disease that could kill more men than enemy bullets. Rigged with 500-gallon tanks of the chemical pesticide, the aircraft made low-level sweeps like crop-dusting planes over an Alabama cotton field, their mission to eliminate the chance of disease outbreak caused by massive swarms of flies that had grown fat, feasting on the bloated, unburied bodies of Japanese soldiers and scattered human remains littering no man's land. At battalion command posts positioned just behind the front lines, the sounds of American dance music became a surreal sundown ritual that must have convinced Japanese listeners that Marines were indeed completely insane. When battle communications traffic decreased to manageable levels, radio operators tuned their receivers to powerful signals broadcasting from Guam and Pearl Harbor, bringing the sounds of home to this hellish landscape. Some even picked up Tokyo Rose's propaganda broadcasts, with her sultry voice mixing the latest enemy version of events on Iwo Jima with popular American music in an attempt to demoralize American forces. The familiar melodies of Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey, the Andrews Sisters, and the Ink Spots, all the current hits from the Lucky Strike hit parade, drifted clear and beautiful among the ravines and cliffs of this hellish landscape, creating an almost dreamlike contrast with the surrounding destruction. Nearly 4 decades later, Gene Jones would still remember those moments with crystal clarity, even after he had been wounded 3 times as a civilian correspondent, documenting Marines fighting in Korea and Vietnam, and had become a highly successful writer, director, and producer of feature motion pictures. "I will never forget how sweet and beautiful that music was," he reflected with the wisdom of age and experience, "how marvelous and comforting it seemed to our tortured souls." Out across that shattered landscape, across the bodies of dead Marines who would never hear music again, we heard swing music, dance music, languorous and poignant melodies that reminded us of everything we were fighting for. We had won so little ground and lost so many good men and were so bone-tired that we could barely function, but we all listened to that music with tears in our eyes. It meant so much to hear those tender sounds on that awful island amid all the death and destruction that surrounded us like a living nightmare. D-Day+6 marked the first Sunday on Iwo Jima for the American forces, bringing the first week of fighting to a close with no end in sight. Offshore, the mess compartments of warships and transports filled to capacity as sailors and Marines answered church call and prayed for a swift and victorious end to the fighting that seemed to have no conclusion. On Iwo Jima itself, there remained insufficient time and too little safe space to hold many formal religious services, as any gathering of men immediately drew enemy fire. Marines understood that divine intercession alone would not end this vicious conflict. It must run its own terrible course to whatever conclusion awaited them. But wherever conditions permitted, whether in shell holes along the front lines or in protective revetments and craters behind the main battle area. Chaplains held brief interfaith services as small groups of men knelt with their weapons at the ready, seeking whatever spiritual comfort and inspiration they could find in the midst of hell on earth. Services were deliberately brief by necessity. Any cluster of Marines remaining in one location for more than a few minutes invariably drew heavy enemy mortar and artillery fire from Japanese forward observers, who remained constantly alert for such targets. The island had become a place where even prayer carried the risk of death. Japanese forces still controlled more than half of Iwo Jima, and their resistance remained as fierce as ever, showing no signs of weakening despite the tremendous casualties they had suffered. But as the invasion entered its second week, the battle's ultimate outcome was no longer seriously in doubt among those who understood the mathematics of warfare. American forces now outnumbered Suribachi's troops significantly, and any lingering hope the enemy might have harbored of driving the invaders back into the sea had vanished like smoke in the wind. The questions that remained were grim ones that haunted every Marine on the island. When would the fighting finally end, and what would be the final cost in American dead and wounded? Every yard of ground on the island remained within easy range of enemy cannons, heavy mortars, and rockets that could strike without warning. Despite the constant harassment from heavy shelling and the undiminished ferocity of frontline fighting, Iwo Jima was gradually taking on the appearance of an American forward base, albeit one under constant siege from a determined enemy. The chaos that had characterized the beaches during the initial landing was slowly giving way to organized efficiency that would have impressed peacetime inspectors. Although the 2.5 miles of shoreline remained littered with debris for hundreds of yards in places, sufficient progress had been made in clearing operations to allow a steady stream of men, supplies, and equipment to flow ashore in an endless procession of landing craft. Marine and Seabee crane operators and demolitions teams worked around the clock in shifts, their efforts never ceasing as they hoisted or blasted away the grotesque hulks of demolished landing craft and mired vehicles from the deep sand and constant surf. Thousands of men, working as human conveyor belts in long lines that stretched from the water's edge to supply dumps, manually transported thousands of tons of essential supplies, the beans, bullets, and bandages that fed the insatiable appetite of battle and kept the marine war machine functioning. Bulldozers clanked and churned continuously day and night as they carved additional roads inland from the beaches, creating what was rapidly becoming a comprehensive network connecting all American-held territory on Iwo Jima. Other heavy equipment scraped and leveled the shell-pocked runways of Motoyama No. 1, preparing the airstrip for land-based Marine artillery spotter planes, Army Mustang fighters, Navy transport aircraft that would soon airlift casualties to the Marianas, and disabled B-29 superfortresses desperately seeking an emergency landing field after bombing missions over Japan. Equipment operators frequently dove for cover when enemy artillery and mortar fire targeted their positions with deadly accuracy, the Japanese observers calling down fire on anything that moved. Landmines and unexploded ordnance posed constant dangers that claimed lives daily, but when the incoming fire lifted, the men immediately returned to their vital work with the dedication that characterized the American war effort. Hundreds of telephone lines, strung on poles cut from distant Oregon forests and transported across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean, hummed with battle communications linking battalion and regimental command posts with division headquarters, which in turn maintained contact with 5th Amphibious Corps headquarters and the fleet offshore. Beachhead hospitals functioned with remarkable efficiency given the circumstances, treating a constant stream of wounded Marines, and casualties could now be evacuated without the agonizing delays that had characterized the early days of the operation when chaos reigned supreme. A fleet post office aboard an attack transport managed to deliver 11 bags of mail to Yellow Beach letters from Hawaii, addressed to Marines whose families back home did not know, but fearfully suspected, that their loved ones were fighting for their lives on this sulfur island that had become synonymous with death and sacrifice. Piece by piece, everything was falling into place to mount the climactic offensive that would finally secure the island and end this nightmare. General Erskine had now come ashore with 9,000 additional troops. Colonel Howard M. Kenyon's 9th Regiment of highly trained infantry, Colonel Raymond F. Christ's 12th Regiment, with its artillery pieces and howitzers that would provide devastating fire support, and Major Holly M. Evans' 3rd Tank Battalion, which added considerable armoured firepower to the massive force already engaged in the battle. But it would require 2 more weeks of close-quarters fighting before the backbone of enemy resistance could be broken, 2 terrible weeks that would claim 12,000 Marine casualties, representing 1 man wounded or killed every 90 seconds of combat. The mathematics of war were brutal and unforgiving, and every Marine on the island understood that their number might come up at any moment. Even then, for another 2 weeks beyond that, the battle would continue to rage like a stubborn forest fire in isolated pockets, as General Suribachi and his remaining troops fought on with self-annihilating determination, refusing to surrender even when their situation became completely hopeless. The Japanese commander had vowed to make the Americans pay in blood for every yard of his island, and he was keeping that promise with interest. Attack units were forced to absorb replacements to bolster their depleted ranks with whatever manpower became available, regardless of training level or experience. A tragic number of these reinforcements were frightened, undertrained young men little more than boys, who often became casualties within minutes of their first exposure to combat, their youth and inexperience proving fatal in an environment that demanded instant adaptation to survive. A replacement Marine was blessed with extraordinary good fortune if he managed to escape being wounded or killed during his initial days in the line. Richard Newcomb described what happened to 18-year-old Private John Lane of Brooklyn, New York, who was sent forward as a raw replacement to the 25th Regiment with virtually no combat training beyond basic rifle marksmanship. The sergeant's instructions for battle constituted a brief statement of military wisdom, Newcomb wrote with dark humour. He said, "This here is G Company. We are going to move out this morning. This won't be no straight-line advance, so when you see a Japanese soldier, shoot him. You know what a Japanese looks like. Don't shoot any Marines." The sergeant disappeared into the smoke and chaos. What more could a guy need to know about staying alive? Lane proved incredibly fortunate beyond all reasonable expectation. The company's attack was cancelled due to heavy enemy resistance, and he spent the entire day crouched alone in a foxhole, waiting and clutching his rifle with white knuckles, his imagination conjuring enemy soldiers behind every rock and shadow. He never saw a living Japanese soldier, and never fired a shot during his first day of combat. That night he was reassigned as a battalion runner, and most of his subsequent missions involved carrying messages to rear areas, keeping him away from the worst of the fighting, where life expectancy was measured in hours rather than days. Things proved far different for Second Lieutenant Craig Lehman, whose experience illustrated the harsh reality facing replacement officers in combat. Though older at 24 and far better trained, he had graduated from platoon leaders' school at Quantico and possessed at least a basic understanding of what combat entailed. Lehman faced the grim statistics that replacement officers, particularly second lieutenants, had an extremely short life expectancy in combat zones. A pre-medical student from the University of Chicago with dreams of becoming a doctor, Lehman spent several days on the beach helping to unload landing craft and organize supplies before being sent forward to the front lines for the first time. The relatively safe duty on the beach had given him a false sense of security that was about to be shattered. I joined H Company, 26th Marines, replacing a platoon leader who had been killed the day before, he later wrote to a friend back home, his letter filled with the understated horror that characterized Marine correspondence. The platoon was down to 22 men when I arrived. When I left with a head wound 5 days later, we were down to about a dozen effective fighters. The casualty rate was simply staggering. 40 years later, Lehman's memories remained vivid and painful, the images burned into his consciousness by the intensity of the experience. I lost most of my best friends on that island. Most of us didn't really expect to live through the experience, and we talked about it openly. My father saw a newspaper photograph of a dead Marine on the beach and thought it looked like me. He kept the picture hidden from my mother for 2 weeks before learning that I had been wounded rather than killed. I can only imagine what those 2 weeks were like for him. After VJ Day, Lehman continued his medical studies at Harvard and eventually became what he modestly called a working sawbones. In reality, a distinguished surgeon practicing in Corvallis, Oregon, where he saved countless lives and never spoke publicly about his experiences on Iwo Jima until decades later. General Schmidt completely revamped the attack plan for the offensive scheduled to begin on D-Day +6, realizing that previous tactics had proven inadequate against Japanese defenses. The revised strategy was elegantly simple in concept. though implementing it would prove anything but easy given the realities of terrain and enemy resistance. Iwo Jima's treacherous volcanic terrain, General Kuribayashi's diabolical fortifications, and his fanatically determined defenders guaranteed that reality would be far more complex and costly than any plan drawn up in the safety of a command post. Since being committed to the difficult battle for Motoyama No. 2, the 21st Regiment had fought as an integral part of the 4th Marine Division, integrating their operations with units they had never trained with before. But with the decision to commit additional elements of General Erskine's 3rd Division, that unit lost its floating reserve status, although its battle-tested, combat-ready 3rd Regiment remained aboard transports 20 miles offshore, waiting for the call to join the carnage. Under the aggressive leadership of Big E. Erskine, a general who believed in leading from the front, the 3rd Division would now fight under its own colours and assume responsibility from the other divisions for the attack up the centre of the island. Their mission was to hammer through Kuribayashi's main defensive belt, centred around the 2nd airstrip, crush organised resistance through sheer force and determination, then push across the relatively flat Motoyama Plateau to the north and drive the enemy from the unfinished Motoyama No. 3 airfield, ultimately breaking through to Iwo Jima's northern shoreline, where the Japanese would have nowhere left to retreat. On the right flank, the 4th Division would continue its northward advance, while simultaneously pivoting eastward into the rugged cliffs along the eastern coast, a sector of convoluted hills and ravines stripped bare of vegetation by intensive shelling and infested with hundreds of heavily camouflaged gun emplacements that could strike without warning. The terrain looked like the surface of an alien planet, barren and hostile to human life. The 5th Division, holding the left flank, would drive straight ahead on the western front through a 2-square-mile area that constituted a natural death trap for both tanks and infantry, a maze of winding ridges and deep canyons where Kuribayashi had positioned his most insidious system of interconnected caves and would ultimately make his final stand when all other positions had fallen. Back home in the United States, Iwo Jima dominated front-page headlines as Americans anguished over the mounting casualties and wondered when the seemingly endless battle would finally conclude. Families across the nation watched their mailboxes with dread, fearing the telegram that would shatter their world. But the Pacific struggle was rapidly becoming secondary news relegated to sidebar status as Allied forces drove deeper into Germany and the day of victory in Europe drew near, capturing the attention of war correspondents and the public imagination. Fewer than 20 civilian reporters and photographers remained on the scene to document the ongoing carnage. Representatives of the major press services, radio networks, weekly news magazines, and a handful of mass circulation daily newspapers. Most of the restless brigade of correspondents who had covered D-Day had departed for Guam, accompanying Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal and Admiral Raymond Spruance to join the gathering armada preparing for the invasion of Okinawa, which promised to be even more costly than Iwo Jima. Some of Iwo Jima's worst fighting would receive little more than passing mention in news stories as the battleground inexorably toward its conclusion. The American public's attention focused elsewhere. The burden of recording eyewitness accounts fell primarily to Marine combat correspondents, many of whom would be wounded or killed while documenting the heroism and sacrifice of their fellow Marines. Their reports would be delayed in military communication channels before reaching publication in the United States, often arriving weeks after the events they described. Occasionally, stories of particularly spectacular or heroic actions would be written by civilian reporters and transmitted stateside via high-speed radio teletype, bringing brief moments of the battle's reality to American breakfast tables. Intermittent live broadcasts originated from Admiral Turner's flagship El Dorado, providing radio audiences with sanitized versions of the ongoing struggle. But in general, the unfolding battle received only cursory attention, described in terms of strange and distant place names that meant nothing to civilians back home: Hills Peter and Obo, Turkey Knob, the Amphitheatre, Hill 382, Motoyama Village, Nishi Ridge, Kita, Cushman's Pocket, and countless unnamed objectives that exacted a merciless toll of Marine lives during the coming month. After the first week of fighting, increasing amounts of news coverage about the campaign was written from Admiral Nimitz's daily communiques rather than from first-hand observation by reporters who had witnessed the horror personally. Even as the battle reached its climax, Iwo Jima was becoming a meanwhile story in roundup articles about global military developments. After reporting the latest developments in General Eisenhower's crusade in Europe, front-page coverage typically read, "Meanwhile, Marines on Iwo Jima continued their advance against fierce Japanese resistance. Military censorship contributed significantly to the reduced coverage, as commanders sought to maintain operational security while managing public morale. The monks of Makalapa, as Nimitz's staff officers were known, wanted to keep secret from the Japanese the extent of frightful Marine losses, and they were equally determined to shield the American home front from the full horror of the casualties that were mounting at an alarming rate. Military leaders believed nothing could be gained by providing an official yard-by-yard, day-by-day account of the island's conquest, fearing that detailed casualty reports would undermine public support for the war effort. General Kuribayashi and the warlords in Tokyo understood perfectly well that the Americans were on Iwo Jima to stay, that it was simply a matter of time and lives before the island fell completely under American control. Shortly after midnight on D-Day +6, Admiral Ichimaru, Kuribayashi's second-in-command, acknowledged this reality in a message to Imperial General Headquarters that reflected the Japanese military's acceptance of their fate. He asked Emperor Hirohito's forgiveness for failing to push the Marines back into the sea on D-Day, but vowed to fight to the death with typical Japanese determination. "Real battles are to come from now on. Every man of my command fully realizes the importance of this battle for the future of the nation and is determined to defend this island at any cost, fulfilling this honorable duty even if it means our complete annihilation." Skies remained cloudless at dawn as the second week of battle commenced, promising another day of killing under perfect weather conditions. Beginning at 8 o'clock, Japanese positions endured 50 minutes of devastating bombardment from the massive guns of battleships and cruisers, supplemented by Marine heavy artillery that had been positioned during the night. This was followed by 60 carrier-based aircraft, unleashing 500-pound bombs and screaming 5-inch rockets along the entire front in a display of American industrial might that shook the earth. This marked the first time Colonel Kenyon's 9th Regiment had witnessed the full display of American firepower at close range as they awaited the signal to advance into hell. Howard "Red" Kenyon was a legendary figure among his men, a tough, stern disciplinarian who had proven his mettle in previous campaigns and earned their complete trust. His distinctive appearance was unmistakable: close-cropped red hair and a luxuriant copper-colored waxed mustache that curved upward at the ends, giving him the appearance of a frontier marshal from the Old West. His 5'10" frame carried the unmistakable bearing of a fighting Marine, and his men took fierce pride in serving under his command. "He can be 7 kinds of stubborn when he wants to be," acknowledged one battle-hardened gunnery sergeant with obvious affection, "but he's our man and we'll follow him anywhere he says to go, even if it's straight into the gates of hell." That morning, the objective was Hill Peter, a 360-foot pile of blasted debris and jagged rocks bristling with Japanese defensive positions, the last major obstacle to securing Motoyama No. 2 and the formidable terrain surrounding it. The hill dominated the landscape like a malevolent fortress, its slopes honeycombed with caves and tunnels that sheltered determined defenders. H-hour was set for 9:30, and the Marines prepared themselves for another day of close-quarters fighting. The attack began precisely on schedule, with 2 battalions spearheading the assault, the 1st and 2nd, commanded respectively by Lieutenant Colonels Carey A. Randall and Robert E. Cushman, both decorated veterans of the brutal campaigns on Bougainville and Guam, who understood the deadly nature of Pacific warfare. Within minutes, the offensive stalled and nearly collapsed entirely as the Marines encountered the full fury of Japanese defensive fire. The 9th Marines rapidly discovered that everything they had heard about the ferocity and deadly accuracy of enemy fire was completely accurate, and most of it was emanating from caves and positions on the summit of Hill Peter, where Japanese soldiers had prepared to die defending their positions. 6 of Major Holly Evans's Sherman tanks moved onto the edge of the airstrip in a desperate attempt to silence enough Japanese firepower to get the stalled attack moving again. Before they could even achieve effective firing positions, armor-piercing shells began crashing into the 3 leading tanks with devastating accuracy. Angel and Agony took direct hits and were immediately enveloped in flames and smoke, their crews scrambling frantically to escape the inferno before the ammunition cooked off. Eitaball sustained significant damage but retained the ability to fire. Its 75mm cannon and machine guns laid down continuous covering fire, as Marines scrambled for any available protection in the volcanic terrain. 22-year-old Corporal William R. Adamson dove for cover alongside Agony's motionless treads and was immediately struck in the leg by machine gun fire that shattered bone and tore muscle. Though he could see the wound clearly and felt the warm blood soaking his pants, he was amazed to feel relatively little pain, adrenaline and shock temporarily masking the severity of his injury. He dragged himself 10 yards to the front of 80 Ball, where he fashioned a tourniquet from his torn pants leg, his hands shaking as he worked. For several minutes he crouched there in the minimal shelter provided by the tank, wondering what to do next as bullets whined overhead. He was certain he would never again see his family in San Jose, California, but he had resolved to die fighting rather than surrender or give up, drawing on the Marine training that had been hammered into him during boot camp. "What else can I do?" he thought, muttering to himself at the precise moment he spotted the muzzle flash of the anti-tank gun that had destroyed the Shermans and continued firing at anything that moved. Adamson half-crawled, half-hobbled several steps forward despite his wounded leg, and waving frantically and shouting at the top of his lungs, pointed toward the enemy weapon, hoping 80 Ball's crew would see his signal and understand what he was trying to communicate. They did, responding immediately to his desperate gestures. The tank's main gun silenced the position with a single well-placed round that sent debris flying in all directions. Now, crouched in a shell hole that provided better protection, the corporal spotted 4 machine gun positions that were cutting down Marines with methodical precision and again alerted 8 Ball, whose commander had opened his hatch for better visibility of the action despite the obvious danger. A series of precisely aimed machine gun bursts eliminated the enemy positions and their 12 gunners, silencing their weapons permanently. But the furious firefight was far from over, as more Japanese positions revealed themselves. A lone Japanese soldier, clutching a satchel of explosives and shouting what sounded like a prayer or battle cry, broke from cover and charged toward the tank with suicidal determination, only to be cut down by defensive fire before he could reach his target. As he collapsed, screaming to the ground, 30 enemy troops launched a desperate assault from a ravine 30 yards away, firing their bayoneted rifles as they advanced in a banzai charge that epitomized Japanese fighting spirit. The tank's cannon and machine guns eliminated them before they could close the distance, their bodies falling in windrows across the volcanic sand. Suddenly there was a brief lull in the fighting, an eerie quiet that seemed almost more ominous than the previous chaos. Adamson crawled under 8 Ball and was pulled through its bottom escape hatch by the crew, who had watched his heroic actions with amazement. Within minutes, a tank retriever had towed the battered Sherman to safety behind a ridge where it could be repaired. Other tanks assumed the point and clanked across the airstrip 200 yards ahead of the infantry, their commanders knowing they were likely heading into similar ambushes. Adamson survived his ordeal and was subsequently awarded the Navy Cross for his heroic actions, proving that courage could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. His earlier certainty about never seeing home again proved wrong, and he had not died fighting after all. But it was a goddamned close call, he later reflected with typical Marine understatement. In total, 26 tanks and 2,000 Marines became involved in the fierce engagement that raged across the airstrip and surrounding terrain. Except for the suicidal charge by Japanese troops attempting to reach Ball, the Americans had encountered fewer than a dozen visible enemy soldiers since the jump-off, fighting instead against an invisible enemy that struck from concealed positions. Anti-tank weapons, machine guns and rifles firing from concealed positions, plus heavy mortars and artillery directed from behind Hill Peter, had essentially stopped the attack cold, proving once again that the Japanese had mastered the art of defensive warfare. By 2:30 in the afternoon, after 5 hours of brutal combat that had claimed hundreds of casualties, the advance in the center sector had gained less than 100 yards, progress measured in feet rather than miles. One platoon managed to fight its way to the base of the hill through sheer determination and courage, but was subsequently forced to withdraw when their position became untenable. Casualties had been so severe and ammunition supplies so depleted that the position could not be maintained. Only 14 men remained of the 40 who had begun the assault, the rest killed or wounded in the grinding advance. By 3:30, forward movement had ceased entirely, and the situation had deteriorated from grim to desperate, with Marines pinned down by enemy fire from multiple directions. A dangerous gap opened between the two battalions, and frantic attempts to close the breach with reinforcements only added to the deadly confusion as units became intermixed and command and control broke down. Darkness was approaching before the lines could be consolidated when Lieutenant Colonel Harold C. Boehm's 3rd Battalion managed to come to the aid of Bob Cushman's decimated unit and establish contact with Carey Randall's forces. Nearly 400 Marines had fallen during the 9th Regiment's first day of combat on Iwo Jima, a casualty rate that would have broken the spirit of lesser units. Hill Peters' defenders continued to rake the front with lethal fire, their positions seemingly impervious to American firepower. 9 of Holly Evans' 26 tanks had been knocked out of action, and 17 crewmen had been killed or wounded in the day-long struggle, demonstrating that even armoured vehicles were vulnerable to Japanese defensive preparations. On the 4th Division front, the battle raged with fury that matched, and possibly exceeded, that which had savaged Red Kenyon's regiment. General Clifton Cates, maintaining his dapper appearance even in combat conditions and chain-smoking Chesterfield cigarettes through an ebony holder that had become his trademark, had shaved before dawn despite the challenging conditions. During the night, his tarpaulin-covered shell-hole command post had been shaken repeatedly by heavy mortar impacts that had killed his radio operator and wounded 2 staff officers. Now this University of Tennessee law graduate, who had never practiced law but had chosen the Marines instead because he craved action and adventure, was on a crackling field telephone with Colonel Walter Wensinger, whose 23rd Regiment would spearhead the day's offensive against positions that had already claimed hundreds of Marine lives. "See if you can find a weak spot in their defenses," Cates instructed his regimental commander, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had seen too much death. "And keep attacking until you break through, no matter what it costs us." Colonel Walter Jordan received similar orders for his 24th Marines, delivered in slightly different terminology, but with the same underlying message: attack regardless of casualties. What their 4 assault battalions, approximately 3,800 troops, faced was an unknown number of Japanese soldiers strongly entrenched in terrain that was unbelievable, even by Iwo Jima's standards of defensive excellence. This defensive complex represented a masterpiece of concealment and construction that Marines quickly dubbed, with supreme justification and bitter irony, the meat grinder. It would require 7 terrible days before this position was finally silenced, a full week before it stopped consuming Marines, who daily hurled themselves against a quartet of natural strongpoints that the Japanese had made nearly impregnable through an elaborate system of connecting tunnels and reinforcement of every key position with concrete and steel. The defensive network consisted of 4 primary components that worked in deadly harmony: Hill 382, the rubble of what had once been Minami Village, a bowl-shaped, boulder-strewn area called the Amphitheatre, and a craggy escarpment that Marines would remember with hatred as Turkey Knob. Individually, each position was formidable enough to stop a regiment. Collectively, they created a killing ground of unprecedented lethality that would claim thousands of American lives. Hill 382 stood 250 yards northeast of where the 3rd Division continued its struggle to eliminate the last Japanese defenders from Motoyama No. 2, dominating the surrounding terrain like a medieval castle. Across the crest of 382 lay the twisted skeleton of a Japanese radar installation steel girders scattered among the rubble of a demolished cinder block building like the bones of some prehistoric monster. Below this wreckage stood a 2-story concrete blockhouse, bristling with artillery and anti-tank weapons that could strike targets throughout the American sector. The stronghold was surrounded by carefully camouflaged machine gun positions and concealed spider traps, equipped with steel covers to protect lurking snipers who could pick off unwary Marines at long range. Each defensive position provided covering fire for the others through interlocking fields of fire that made approach from any direction virtually suicidal, creating a web of death that trapped anyone foolish enough to enter. An elaborate tunnel system honeycombed the entire hill, nearly 1,000 yards of interconnected caves that served multiple purposes: ammunition storage that kept the defenders supplied, troop movement routes that allowed reinforcement of threatened positions, and escape routes when specific positions were overrun by American attacks. Light and medium tanks had been dug in turret deep throughout the labyrinth of ravines and ridges in the immediate area, their cannons covering every conceivable approach to the escarpment with deadly accuracy. Turkey Knob presented an ugly outcropping of volcanic rock shaped like a lopsided football, its surface scarred by millions of years of volcanic activity. Located 600 yards south of Hill 382, it represented Iwo Jima's second highest elevation. Only Mount Suribachi towered higher above the surrounding landscape. From ground level, 382 appeared relatively barren and harmless, deceiving the eye with its innocent appearance. But its sloping summit served as a massive observation post, equipped with high-powered binoculars and primitive electronic artillery detection equipment that covered every yard of the southern portion of the island. Deep within the hill's interior lay a 30 by 40-foot communications center, protected by concrete walls, 4 feet thick, and a steel-reinforced roof, capable of withstanding heavy naval bombardment and direct hits from 500-pound bombs without sustaining serious structural damage. This command bunker served as the nerve center for Japanese defensive operations throughout the sector. 200 yards west of Turkey Knob, the ground dropped sharply to form a natural tiered bowl resembling a stadium without seating. The amphitheater, so named by Marines who appreciated its classical appearance even as they died trying to capture it. On its 3 terraces, Japanese engineers had constructed concrete blockhouses along the southern side of the depression, positioning them to provide mutual support. These positions were linked by 700 yards of tunnels, whose walls were lined with communications and electrical cables that kept the defenders in constant contact with each other and their commanders. Anti-tank guns and machine guns covered all approaches to the area from the south, creating crossfire patterns that made advance virtually impossible. The Japanese had turned this natural formation into a death trap that would claim hundreds of Marine lives before it was finally silenced. Minami had been one of Iwo Jima's 5 civilian settlements before the war transformed this peaceful island into a fortress, home to families who had lived here for generations. Now it existed only as a pile of debris and rubble, but within the devastation of its half-dozen concrete buildings was concentrated a deadly array of machine gun positions, mortar pits, and sniper-infested spider traps that made every step forward a potential death sentence. The landscape had become a jumble of torn scrub vegetation, razor-sharp volcanic rock that could cut through clothing and flesh, and carefully concealed Japanese soldiers waiting with infinite patience for Marines to attack. Hill 382, with its commanding elevation and massive fortifications, served as the keystone of the meat grinder's awesome defensive system. Before there could be any realistic hope of silencing the other objectives, 382 had to be captured at whatever cost in American blood. As long as it remained in Japanese hands, it also severely hampered the 3rd Division's advance up the center of the island, its observation posts calling down devastating artillery fire on any movement. Shortly after 8 o'clock on D-Day +6, Marines launched their attack against the hill with the grim determination of men who understood they were walking into hell. The assault was preceded by the now customary naval bombardment and airstrikes that had become as routine as morning coffee. When Major James L. Scales' unit, the 3rd Battalion of the 23rd Marines, jumped off, it was immediately struck by the equally customary violent enemy response that demonstrated the futility of the preliminary bombardment. The Japanese had again waited for the shelling and bombing to cease before revealing their positions, emerging from deep bunkers like deadly flowers blooming in response to sunlight. 6 tanks moved forward in a futile attempt to spearhead the attack across terrain that seemed designed to destroy armored vehicles. 4 were knocked out within minutes. 2 struck landmines that had been carefully positioned along likely approach routes, while 2 others took direct hits from concealed anti-tank guns that fired with deadly accuracy. The 2 survivors made minimal progress, their treads spinning uselessly as they dug deep furrows in the volcanic sand without gaining any meaningful ground. Machine guns, rifle fire, hand grenades, and mortars tore into the advancing infantry like invisible scythes, cutting down Marines before they could even see their attackers. Bringing up flamethrowers and demolitions experts proved impossible under the withering fire that seemed to come from every direction at once, but scattered squads and individual Marines continued to press forward with the stubborn courage that had become their trademark. A platoon from the company commanded by Captain Stanley G. McDaniel of Duncan, Oklahoma, managed to fight its way to the summit through sheer determination and courage that defied rational explanation, only to be immediately isolated by a savage counterattack that threatened to annihilate them completely. Fire from bypassed positions proved merciless, and enemy artillery and mortars made it impossible for the rest of the company to break through and provide the support they desperately needed. It required 2 hours of desperate, sometimes hand-to-hand combat, before the isolated platoon could withdraw under cover of a smokescreen that provided minimal concealment. The situation had become so desperate that 10 wounded Marines had to be abandoned on the hill until after darkness, when volunteer stretcher teams risked their lives to rescue them in a mission that epitomized Marine loyalty to their fallen comrades. One Marine, separated from his unit and suffering from a broken leg that left him helpless, lay motionless throughout the night and part of the following day as Japanese soldiers moved around his position. Enemy troops swarmed around his hiding place repeatedly during the dark hours, but somehow he remained undiscovered. Either the darkness concealed his presence, or the enemy assumed he was already dead and not worth bothering with. He was finally rescued shortly after 10 o'clock the next morning when Marines regained the contested ground in another costly assault. By mid-afternoon, it had become painfully obvious that the attack was accomplishing nothing until something could be done to reduce the intensity of Japanese resistance, something that Marine infantry and tanks had thus far proven unable to achieve, despite their best efforts and tremendous sacrifice. Orders went out at 4 o'clock to prepare for concentrated shelling and airstrikes against the hill that would dwarf previous bombardments. Marine howitzers unleashed 30 minutes of continuous bombardment beginning at 4:30, delivering a rolling barrage that began 200 yards into no man's land and advanced 100 yards deeper into enemy-held territory every 5 minutes, like a moving wall of destruction. Then, for 15 minutes, Marine Corsairs and Navy Hellcats crisscrossed the front in devastating low-level bombing and rocket attacks that shook the earth and filled the air with smoke and debris. The punishing combination of firepower achieved its intended effect. It temporarily suppressed the torrent of Japanese artillery and mortar fire, and drove enemy machine gunners from their pillboxes into the safety of the hill's deep cave system, where they could wait out the storm. It was nearly sunset too late to mount a fresh attack before nightfall, but the bombardment allowed Marines to collect their wounded and establish a solid defensive perimeter for the night ahead. Nearly 500 men had been lost during the first day's assault on the meat grinder, a sickening price to pay for an advance of 100 yards that barely registered on tactical maps. Hill 382 remained firmly in Japanese hands, its defenders ready to exact an even higher price the following day. The mathematics of warfare on Iwo Jima were brutal and unforgiving, with each yard of ground purchased with American blood. Heavy firefights erupted several times during the night as enemy forces attempted to infiltrate Marine positions under cover of darkness. 30 Japanese raiders, many wielding traditional samurai sabers that glinted in the moonlight, struck Captain Donald S. Callahan's company shortly before midnight in a desperate attempt to disrupt American preparations for the next day's assault. Some of them spoke English. He reported the following morning with the matter-of-fact tone of a man who had seen everything. They jumped into empty foxholes around our perimeter and yelled like Marines, but their English was obviously fake and we identified them quickly. They tried to confuse us by shouting American commands, but they couldn't fool Marines who had been fighting together for months. Approximately 20 enemy bodies surrounded the Marine positions the next morning, testimony to the futility of their infiltration attempt. There were no American casualties from this ill-conceived night attack, but Callahan's company had lost 60 men during the day's futile attempt to capture the hill, reducing his effective strength to barely half of its authorized level. Find a weak spot in their defenses, General Cates had ordered with the desperation of a commander running out of options. There were no weak spots to be found in the Japanese defensive system. And keep attacking until you break through. Attacking was all the Marines could do under the circumstances, throwing themselves against prepared positions in the hope that courage and determination would somehow overcome concrete and steel. Jim Lucas, the Marine correspondent whose eyewitness account of the Tarawa massacre had been the first to reach the United States and had shocked the American public, had spent the entire day under fire on the front lines documenting the carnage. Now, a breveted first lieutenant decorated for his work at Tarawa, he wrote with the weariness of a man who had seen too much death. It was terrible at Tarawa, but that battle was over in 72 hours of concentrated hell. This nightmare just continues from one ridge to another, seemingly without end, like some cruel joke played by the gods of war. When will it finally be finished? And will anybody still be alive when it is? We're losing the best Marines America has ever produced, and for what a few hundred yards of worthless volcanic rock. Harry the horse, Liversedge's 28th Regiment completed mopping up operations around Mount Suribachi, eliminating the last pockets of resistance from caves and tunnels that honeycombed the volcanic peak. They left a security platoon to guard the observation post on the summit, now accessible by a narrow road that engineers had carved from the mountainside, and moved north to join the 5th Division's assault on the Western Front, where fresh horrors awaited them. There was no major Marine attack along the 1,200-yard western sector on D-Day +6, as commanders decided to give their exhausted troops a brief respite before resuming the offensive. Exhausted troops rested in whatever shelter they could find, received new equipment and replacements to fill the gaps in their ranks, and maintained constant vigilance for Japanese infiltrators or counterattacks that could come at any moment. In other campaigns, this might have been considered a day of heavy action, but not on Iwo Jima, where the definition of combat had been redefined by the intensity of Japanese resistance. Enemy shells continued to fall regularly among Marine positions with methodical precision, claiming 163 casualties even during this supposed lull in fighting. Shortly after 3:30 in the afternoon, part of the front erupted in 15 minutes of intensive Marine artillery fire when Japanese forces were spotted attempting to move 75mm cannons and anti-tank guns to new positions in broad daylight. It proved a foolish maneuver that demonstrated either desperation or miscalculation on the part of Japanese commanders, the only time during the entire battle that the enemy attempted such movement during daylight hours when American observers could see every detail. More than 100 Japanese soldiers were eliminated in the concentrated bombardment, and Kuribayashi lost 9 desperately needed artillery pieces, several trucks, and a significant cache of his dwindling ammunition supplies that could not be replaced. About 1 hour after dark, when the island had settled into its nightly routine of harassment fire and infiltration attempts, General Erskine summoned Colonel Kenyon to his command post for a conference that would change the nature of the fighting. "Red, we've got to try something different to break through their defenses," he said thoughtfully, studying the tactical situation with the eye of an experienced combat commander. "Something we haven't attempted anywhere against the Japanese in this war." The general read the colonel's puzzled expression and anticipated his unspoken question with the directness that characterized Marine leadership. "Do you think your men could execute a night attack?" he asked, knowing he was proposing something that violated standard Marine doctrine and carried enormous risks. Kenyon replied that his Marines would give their absolute best effort regardless of the odds, but they were exhausted from days of continuous combat, and the battalions had been severely depleted by casualties that had claimed many of his best leaders. Erskine studied the tactical map spread before him, recalled some of the night attacks he had led against German positions in France during World War I when he was a young officer, learning the art of war, and decided to postpone the scheme temporarily while he considered all the implications. Aboard the flagship El Dorado, Admiral Kelly Turner reviewed the entire day's radio and teletype transmissions from General Harry Schmidt's headquarters on the beachhead with the obsessive attention to detail that had made him one of the Navy's most successful amphibious commanders. He scanned copies of all traffic that harried yeomen had prepared throughout the day, whether urgent dispatches from Admiral Nimitz on Guam or simple requests for weather forecasts that might affect the next day's operations. Turner maintained an inviolable rule that he personally examine every message received or transmitted by his flagship, sometimes numbering in the hundreds daily during major operations. This represented one of his methods for maintaining what Howlin' Mad Smith suspected was excessive oversight of Marine operations. Another case of an admiral wanting to be a general, whether or not it was any of his business. The inter-service rivalry that had plagued the Pacific War continued even in the midst of the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history. Aboard the Auburn, General Smith had little to occupy his time beyond nightly cribbage games with Admiral Hill, a routine that had become as regular as the evening bombardments. Conduct of the battle lay in other hands, and the cantankerous old warrior understood this reality perfectly, though it frustrated him to be sidelined during the climactic battle of his career. He fumed over Nimitz's explicit order restricting him to going ashore for inspection purposes only, and complained bitterly to a correspondent who had covered Tarawa with him. "I suppose they brought me along in case something happens to Harry Schmidt, like some kind of insurance policy." Marines on the front lines maintained sharp vigilance for infiltrators, while still expecting the massive banzai charge that never materialized, their nerves stretched to the breaking point by constant tension. They took turns attempting to sleep amid the nightly fireworks display, and between barrages of harassment, fire from mortars and artillery that seemed designed more to prevent rest than to cause casualties. Sleep became a precious commodity that men hoarded like ammunition. Behind the lines, around the beaches and Motoyama No. 1 airfield, the inexorable buildup of American military power continued around the clock with the efficiency that characterized the American war machine. The first signs of creature comfort began appearing as Marine cooks and bakers located propane stoves, pots, and pans in regimental supply dumps and established field kitchens that brought the smell of hot food to men who had been living on cold rations. Corporal Wilbur L. Houston of Taylorville, Illinois, served as a cook with his own unique challenges that seemed to multiply daily. He spent the night brewing coffee Joe to the Marines to be transported to the front in 20-gallon thermal containers carried by jeeps that risked enemy fire with every trip forward. He had planned to send donuts and pastries along with the coffee, bringing a taste of home to men who desperately needed morale boosters, but enemy mortars struck a nearby ammunition dump, and his batter became a casualty of the explosions that rocked the entire area. "Those Japanese will do anything to make things difficult for a guy," he lamented with the dark humor that kept Marines sane in impossible circumstances. "They probably have spies watching our bakery operations and calling down fire whenever we try to make something decent for the boys." Dawn of D-Day +7 broke under cloudless skies that promised another day of perfect weather for killing, warm by Iwo Jima's standards, though Marines still found the temperature uncomfortably chilly in the early morning hours. Hill Peter again served as the primary objective for the 9th Regiment, as they jumped off following the now routine naval bombardment, artillery fire, and airstrikes against Japanese positions along and behind the front that had become as predictable as sunrise. Major Holly Evans' tanks spearheaded the 2-battalion attack with the determination of men who understood that armor was essential to success, despite the previous day's losses. A flamethrower tank at the point immediately ignited a line of pillboxes and bunkers in front of the hill, with its blazing stream of napalm that turned concrete fortifications into crematoriums. 6 additional Sherman tanks, their cannons firing as rapidly as sweating crewmen could load shells into the breaches, blasted everything that resembled an enemy fortification with methodical precision. 30 Marine artillery pieces delivered timed barrages that screamed into no man's land just 200 yards ahead of the advancing infantry, walking the explosions forward in perfect coordination with the ground assault. Marines scampered from hole to hole, rock to rock, crevice to crevice, while enduring savage eruptions of mortar fire, and a bedlam of grenades and small arms fire that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. It proved another day of gains measured in feet rather than yards, progress so minimal that it barely registered on tactical maps back at division headquarters. All day long, the 9th Marines battled to gain the high ground that blocked their advance, but by nightfall there had been no significant progress, summarized the regimental daily log with stark honesty that reflected the futility of the day's efforts. That night, Erskine and Kenyon met again in the General's blackout tent for another conference that would determine the fate of hundreds of Marines. Erskine had decided to proceed with the night attack despite the risks involved, reasoning that conventional tactics had proven inadequate against Japanese defenses. He instructed the colonel to begin preparing his men for an operation that would either achieve breakthrough or result in catastrophic casualties. After a day of rest and receiving new weapons to replace burned-out rifles and machine guns damaged by the volcanic sand that got into everything, the 5th Division jumped off with renewed determination and the desperate energy of men who wanted nothing more than to end this nightmare. A feeling of, "let's finish this and get off this godforsaken rock," provided urgency to their attack that was almost palpable in the morning air. But this surge of resolution was quickly extinguished by harsh reality as Colonel Chester Graham's 26th Regiment advanced into the deep ravines and craggy hills of Iwo Jima's western front, terrain that seemed designed by some malevolent architect to favor defenders. Major Amadeo Reyes' 2nd Battalion led the assault and absorbed the brunt of enemy reaction, a deadly cascade of artillery and mortars, plus continuous streams of machine gun and small arms fire that turned the landscape into a shooting gallery where Marines were the targets. By 10:30 in the morning, the battalion had gained 50 yards while losing 34 men to enemy fire, a casualty rate that would have been considered catastrophic in any previous war. 3 tanks moved forward to provide support, but they proved unable to maneuver effectively in the broken terrain that channeled them into killing zones. By noon, when a chilly rain began falling and further dampened the stalled attack, the battalion had clawed ahead another 50 yards at the cost of 23 additional casualties. A recurring phenomenon on Iwo Jima was that multiple small-scale battles often raged simultaneously in different sectors, isolated from one another by hills or ravines that created separate worlds of combat. Frequently, while one unit fought desperately for survival in one sector, another unit a short distance away on the opposite side of a ridge encountered relatively light resistance, creating a patchwork battlefield where death was distributed unevenly. This was the case with the 2nd Battalion of the 27th Marines under Major John Antonelli's command. His troops operated approximately 200 yards to the left of Rea's force, where the terrain was less rugged and provided minimal cover for enemy defenders who had been forced to construct hasty positions. Instead of taking heavy casualties from hidden and well-fortified positions, Antonelli's Marines encountered light opposition from approximately 100 Japanese riflemen, occupying shallow trenches and foxholes that offered little protection. The Marines made quick work of this resistance, with the efficiency born of experience, and advanced 400 yards in less than 45 minutes, demonstrating what could be accomplished when terrain favored the attackers. Shortly after 4 o'clock, with sheets of rain transforming Iwo Jima's volcanic soil into a quagmire of sticky mud that clung to everything, the 5th Division's attack ground to a halt, and the men established defensive positions for another long night. Hill 382 remained the defiant obstacle to 4th Division progress, looming over the battlefield like some ancient fortress that refused to fall despite repeated assaults. General Cates was determined to capture it by nightfall, knowing that every day it remained in enemy hands cost additional American lives. Its defenders proved equally determined to hold their ground as long as possible, while eliminating Marines until the last man fell, embodying the Japanese military philosophy of death before dishonor. Major Jim Scales' 3rd Battalion of the 23rd Regiment led the attack once again, this time reinforced by Lieutenant Colonel Louis B. Blissard's 1st Battalion in a coordinated assault that represented the division's maximum effort. The meat grinder immediately demonstrated that it had lost none of its lethal effectiveness overnight, erupting in violence that exceeded even the previous day's carnage. Both 382 and Turkey Knob came alive with defensive fire that seemed to emerge from the very rocks themselves. The torrent of defensive fire ambushed the 1st Battalion's Charlie Company within minutes of the jump-off, cutting down Marines like wheat before a scythe. Within 30 minutes, 17 men lay dead and 26 others had been wounded, reducing the company's effective strength by nearly half. Smoke grenades provided cover for stretcher teams, evacuating casualties, while the remaining Marines pressed forward with grim determination, knowing that retreat meant abandoning their wounded comrades. Miraculously, despite the devastating casualties, the attack managed to reach the base of Hill 382 through the heroic efforts of individual Marines who refused to be stopped. One significant factor in this limited success was the extraordinary heroism of 19-year-old Private First Class Douglas T. Jacobson from Rochester, New York, a young man who embodied everything the Marine Corps represented. Jacobson had lied about his age to enlist, adding 2 years to his actual age because he was desperate to fight for his country before the war ended. He had already participated in the vicious conquest of Saipan despite his youth, and was now applying his hard-won combat experience on an island that would test him beyond anything he had previously faced. When a bazooka operator was cut down by machine gun fire that shattered his chest, Jacobson seized the fallen man's weapon and a satchel of explosives without hesitation. For the next 30 minutes, he became a one-man engine of destruction that would be remembered long after the battle ended. Grunting under the burden of the bazooka and the load of demolitions that weighed him down, his ragged dungarees drenched with the sweat of exertion and anxiety, Jacobson sprinted in a running and weaving crouch toward the embrasure of a pillbox that was spouting fire from a chattering machine gun. The position was knocked out in a loud explosion that sent concrete fragments flying in all directions, and he could hear the screams of its burning occupants as he vaulted over a boulder in front of another bullet-spitting fire pit. In a single blast from the bazooka, it went silent permanently. A concrete blockhouse was next in his methodical destruction, then another and another and another, until there was no more ammunition left, and Jacobson was forced to halt his rampage. The real miracle of it all was that operating a bazooka usually required 2 men working in coordination, one to aim and fire, another to load and assist. Yet, somehow, Jacobson had managed to accomplish this single-handedly while under intense enemy fire. Marines who witnessed his incredible performance later counted 16 Japanese positions destroyed and 75 enemy soldiers killed in the young warrior's solitary charge. Like most displays of heroism on Iwo Jima, Jacobson's extraordinary actions were witnessed by only a few men in his immediate vicinity. Most of the company was fighting desperately to hang on to its tenuous foothold on the obstinate hill and was too occupied, trying to survive, to watch individual acts of courage. But his onslaught opened a gap in 382's defences that other Marines could exploit, and in the acrid smoke and pelting rain, Item Company managed to claw up the southwestern slopes to the summit. However, their triumph was short-lived. They were pushed off by entrenched enemy troops late in the afternoon, when Japanese reinforcements emerged from the tunnel system to launch a counterattack that threatened to annihilate the Marines who had fought so hard to reach the top. "We hit Hill 382 the hard way," Marine correspondent Dave Dempsey wrote with characteristic understatement, by sending men in a frontal attack against prepared Japanese positions. "Our tanks could not operate effectively on the rocky hillside that was littered with obstacles and mines. It was impossible to bring up flamethrowers and demolitions experts under the withering fire that swept every approach. Our men had to fight their way through terrain that was flanked by enemy guns positioned to create crossfire patterns. Bazookas proved to be invaluable weapons, firing point-blank into enemy positions that other weapons couldn't reach. But after 4.5 hours of continuous fighting, Item Company had to pull off what had become the most expensive piece of real estate on this island. At 4:30 in the afternoon, General Cates called a halt to the day's assault, recognizing that further attacks would be senseless slaughter that would accomplish nothing except adding to the casualty lists. It was after 9 o'clock before the line was consolidated in the downpour that turned the battlefield into a sea of mud, and Marines established defensive positions for another night of harassment and infiltration attempts. The 4th Division had managed to dent, but certainly not break, General Kuribayashi's ring of steel around the meat grinder that continued to dominate the battlefield like an impregnable fortress. The Marines had gained about 200 yards at a tragic cost, 512 fallen Marines, of whom 119 would be buried in the division's burgeoning cemetery that grew larger every day. Doug Jacobson had survived the most hectic day of his young life to earn the Medal of Honor, proving that extraordinary courage could emerge from the most ordinary circumstances when good men were tested by impossible situations.